You've seen the headlines, report after report, telling us that Canadians are losing faith in access to justice. Growing numbers of people who are representing themselves in family court and civil court. And more members of the public expressing their skepticism about legal services, the justice system. What should the bar do? How can the bar respond? What is your responsibility towards the apparently growing numbers of people who say they can't afford a lawyer? Does this mean they can't afford access to justice in Canada? And what does all of this tell us about the future of personal legal services? First of all, let's look at the numbers, which are staggering. We now know that in family court, in both Canada and the United States, more than half of those coming to court come without a lawyer. These numbers are slightly lower in more rural centres, but much higher again in urban centres. For example, in downtown Toronto, we have numbers of over 75% of people filing in family court without a lawyer. In British Columbia, we know that in 2011, 57% of proceedings under the Family Relations Act were conducted by people representing themselves without counsel. And although the numbers aren't quite so high in civil courts and appeal courts, we see the same trend happening there too. British Columbia Court of Appeal recently released figures for 2014 that show that 30% of the appeals being filed in the court are being filed by people representing themselves without counsel. The other thing that's really striking about these numbers is just how rapidly they have risen. The numbers of people who represent themselves now compared to 10, 20 years ago is far, far higher. And one benchmark we can use for this is California. North America's largest jurisdiction, it provides us with a great benchmark when it comes to quantitative data. So in 1971, in the state of California, in 1% of proceedings in family cases, there was a self-represented litigant. Just 1%. However, by 1992, that number had risen to 46%. Again, by 2000, that number had risen to 77%. And today, the number is over 80%. We see the same trend happening in courts in Canada. These figures are astonishing. And the next question that will be coming into your minds is, why would anybody represent themselves? And the answer that we have now, very consistently, not only from my own study of self-represented litigants in Canada, but from other studies as well. The New York Task Force on Access to Justice, reporting in 2013, the Ontario Civil Needs Survey, reporting in 2010, among many others. The biggest barrier that the public sees to access to justice is the cost of legal services. In other words, affording the costs of a lawyer to represent them in court. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I have called the affordability puzzle. Because along with the issue of cost, there are many other things that make these self-represented litigants 21st century consumers of legal services different to the people that you might have dealt with at an earlier stage in your career. And I think it's important for the bar to be able to understand what some of those changes are as we think about how the bar can respond to this population. So first of all, the first and overwhelmingly most important issue for the people that I interviewed, and again, this is consistent with other studies, is the cost of legal services. Most Canadians say that they cannot afford access to legal services except on a short-term and emergency basis. The comment on this next slide is typical of what we heard from many people who we interviewed in our study of self-represented litigants in Canada. This woman said, "It's not that I think that I can do this better than a lawyer. I have no choice. I don't have $350 an hour to pay a lawyer." I'm going to let you hear for a moment firsthand from a self-represented litigant who could not afford a lawyer and whose situation is typical of so many Canadians who find themselves ineligible for legal aid and unable to pay for legal services. In other words, stuck in the middle.
I could not afford a lawyer. And honestly, I didn't know what else was available to me, so I struggled through the whole process of just trying to get through the process. One time I was brought to court, and it was something I had to learn to do. I've lived kind of below the poverty line for the last decade, so even though I was below the poverty line, I couldn't get legal aid. I made too much money. So, what else is there if you can't get legal aid and you can't afford a lawyer? Well, I was stuck in the middle. And, I figured if the other party could do it, then I certainly could. Having a university degree, it means I'm not completely stupid, so I should be able to figure something out. Well, let me tell you how horrifying that experience is. Very frustrating, very aggravating. You feel very alone, very isolated. You feel like there's no help for you. It feels like you're kind of spinning out of control and you don't know where to go. You can get all the information online, but applying it to your situation and having it make sense to you and how it applies to your situation in court is completely different. And doing it on your own, like I said, is very isolating. Trying to get the answers to the questions,
The second part of the affordability puzzle is the perceived value and the priority placed on paying for legal services. For example, some people felt, I think I can do this myself. Why would I spend money on a lawyer when I might need that money for something else that is actually more important? As you can see in the quotes on this slide, something like saving for your child's college education might be valorized over and above paying for the services of a lawyer, especially when people felt, I'm well educated, I'm intelligent, perhaps I can work this out with the resources that I see out there on the internet. One of the things that surprised me the most about the results of my study were that more than half the people I interviewed had actually begun with a lawyer. In other words, they had gone out and retained counsel because that was what they imagined they should do, but they had very quickly run out of their available resources to continue to pay. In other words, they spent far more quickly than most of them anticipated, and some were somewhat dubious about the value for money that they had received in exchange. Many of the people whom I interviewed had spent $10,000, $20,000, some even $50,000, some even $75,000 on legal services before concluding that they were going to have to continue this alone because they simply couldn't continue to raise the money and justify the amount of payments that they were making. The third and final piece in the affordability puzzle is something that sociologists like to call the disintermediation phenomenon. This is what happens when you live in the age of the World Wide Web and see many opportunities for cutting out the middleman, for reducing the cost to yourself of services because you can do it yourself. This is the same phenomenon that leads to people putting lawn signs out that say for sale by owner when they want to sell their property themselves without a realtor, or perhaps going online and investing their own stocks and shares. The same phenomenon is affecting legal services. More and more people are looking at the information that is apparently available free of charge to them on the World Wide Web, and they are preferring to go there, believing that that will give them the same level of service that otherwise they would be paying $350 an hour for. In fact, many of the people whom I interviewed told me that they were seduced in some ways by what looked like the availability of excellent resources on the internet when they began to represent themselves, only to find that this was so much harder, so much more overwhelming, and in fact the resources so much more inadequate than they had first anticipated. The message that I would like to put out to the bar is that although self-represented litigants represent an enormous challenge in so many different ways that I haven't even begun to touch on in this short presentation, they also represent a huge market opportunity. 86% of the people whom I interviewed told me that they sought legal advice. Either they sought it from private counsel, or they applied for legal aid, or they used a duty counsel or other pro bono legal advice service. In other words, almost everybody whom I spoke to wanted the help of a lawyer, but because they felt they couldn't afford it, or they were worried about the costs spiraling out of control, they had found themselves doing this on their own. The second self-represented litigant I want to introduce you to today is Derek, who represented himself in a family case, but first had retained counsel.
There was no choice. I ended my retainer with my lawyer. I set out to represent myself, only to discover that I didn't know anything I needed to know. I couldn't even get the court file from my lawyer until I arranged to pay my bill in full. However, I still felt confident that I could represent myself. Of course, I didn't know what I was doing. But I've got 4 degrees. I have 2 professional certifications. I've got court experience as a social worker. I speak in public regularly. I can download forms. I can prepare an argument. Even if I didn't know the law or court procedures or protocol, I could learn that. It was far harder than I had imagined. The legal process broke me in almost every way. It took most of my time and energy. It drained me financially, emotionally, physically, and intellectually.
So what types of legal services do self-represented litigants want? The first thing that comes out loud and clear from virtually every interview I have conducted with a self-represented litigant is that they would like to be able to buy services on a piecemeal basis from lawyers, what lawyers themselves call unbundled legal services or limited scope representation. I believe that it is very important for the bar to start thinking about how they can more consistently offer services on an unbundled basis that are properly memorialized in a retainer agreement. Secondly, I heard a lot from self-represented litigants that they would like that kind of assistance to prepare them for discrete events. For example, if they had a hearing approaching, perhaps if they had a case settlement conference, or even participating in a mediation. I believe there is a great deal that lawyers can do to help self-represented litigants who will then go forward and appear on their own behalf at these events to be a great deal more effective and, for that matter, more functional. Thirdly, there is, I think, an opportunity here for the bar to start to think about its role as a coach of those who will go forward in a process largely on their own. Many self-represented litigants need help to think about whether or not they could in fact settle this matter, and what kinds of things are really important to them in putting forward some kind of a negotiation proposal. And finally, the traditional role of lawyers in giving summary legal advice is case appraisal. Let's call it reality checking, or even expectations management. There's still a role for that kind of advice to be given to people on an unbundled, limited scope basis. In addition to these types of work, which seem to me to be best accomplished by lawyers, there are other kinds of assistance that self-represented litigants ask for also, which could be offered by lawyers, or they could be offered by other professionals to whom lawyers refer self-represented litigants. These include procedural information. Many people told us that they wanted help looking over their documents, making sure that they had correctly completed the forms that they needed to file. This could be done by a lawyer. For that matter, it could be done by someone without a legal qualification under the supervision of a lawyer. Secondly, they talked to us about wanting cultural know-how, knowing a little bit more about how to operate in the courthouse, what to wear in court, when to stand up and when to sit down, how to address the judge, all the things that are instinctive to lawyers after many years of training. And finally, there is obviously an enormous need for the emotional support of self-represented litigants. Many of the people that I spoke to would say that this was probably their greatest need. And perhaps the legal profession isn't the place that you go to for emotional support, but I feel that it's very important for the bar to understand that they may be the facilitators to some kind of support service for self-represented litigants that will be very important to them being able to handle their matter effectively and to use all the information and coaching that they might receive from lawyers. To conclude, I would like to ask you to consider what I believe to be 3 critical questions for the bar in responding to the self-represented litigant phenomenon. The first one is, to what extent do you see it as your responsibility to ensure that more Canadians can have access to affordable legal services? Second of all, what is the value that lawyers can bring to personal clients? You will have many ideas for what that value is, but the public is saying they don't clearly understand the value that they can get from working with a lawyer. And how can the bar communicate that value effectively to the public? And thirdly, and perhaps the most challenging of all, because this is a personal question for each one of you, to what extent are you willing to modify your traditional modes of practice, both in terms of the kinds of assistance that you will offer people and the ways in which you will structure their financial responsibility? To what extent are you willing to respond to the demand that I'm hearing for unbundled legal services, and also to the questions about assistance with coaching and strategizing and event preparation and document checking? These perhaps are the most challenging questions of all for anyone practicing in the personal services area. If you would like more information about the work of the National Self-Represented Litigants Project, please go to our website, where you will find an array of information, news items, and resources both for self-represented litigants and for legal professionals.